Hi, welcome. My name is Charlotte. I love colorful and sparkly makeup, and here on my channel, I like to be critical of consumerism and capitalism. If that sounds interesting to you, then I would love if you would like this video and subscribe. Today I'm going to be talking about a topic very near to my heart, which I've mentioned before on my channel, and that is ColourPop monochromatic 9 pans. I'm no longer a big consumer of ColourPop, but their monochromatic 9 pans are really how I got into makeup. When I started trying those palettes and experimenting with colorful eyeshadow back in around 2019, that is really what turned me from somebody who just wore eyeliner and mascara every day to somebody who really loved and obsessed over makeup of all kinds. I talked in quite an old video at this point, which I can link below, but I did talk pretty extensively about my background with ColourPop monochromatic 9 pans, why I loved them so much, the special place they hold in my heart, and how the idea of like monochromatic color stories kind of shaped my thinking about makeup. It's really still how I think about my collection and how I build looks. Almost all of my eyeshadow is depotted, and I did just do a big declutter of my eyeshadows, and I finally got them organized again into neat little palettes, organized by color. So this has re-inspired me to think about monochromatic color stories, and also as part of that declutter, I'm getting rid of some of my old ColourPop shimmers, and before those leave my apartment, I wanted to do a few videos in honor of the ColourPop monochromatic 9 pans that I really loved, and ways that I could improve them through my current makeup collection, which is much sparklier, much higher quality than the shimmers in those ColourPop palettes. I should also credit for this idea two creators who I love who also do single shadow content. One of them is Ash at Beneath the Ash Tree here on YouTube. The other is Hannah at Hot Vegan Hannah. Both those creators have had series on their channels where they do monochromatic BYOPs, and I've really loved watching those videos. But without further ado, today I wanted to start off with the ColourPop Mint to Be palette, since it seems like the season for icy mint colors. Here she is in all her glory. There is one shade that I believe I decluttered already. It's like a really light minty matte. I will say also this is not actually the original palette that I bought and used back in 2019 or so. I had some shades break in that original palette, so I ended up actually repurchasing it and passing the unbroken shades on to a friend. That was before I knew as much as I do now about like repressing and depotting and stuff like that. But at the time, this palette was so close to my heart that I felt I wanted a replacement, like clean slate version of it. Here are the shades swatched out. And I actually love the ColourPop matte formula. It's one of my favorite matte formulas. And over the years, I have generally held on to my ColourPop mattes. I think they're especially good for colorful mattes. So I am keeping the vast majority of the mattes from my monochromatic 9 pan palettes. As for the shimmers, some of them aren't so bad. You can see this one and this one are decently shiny and sparkly, but these other two are pretty dull. And at the time, I wasn't really into sparkly makeup, so that didn't bother me. The other thing about these 9 pans is they tend to have a mix of what I would call loosely warm and cool shades, so like different interpretations of the color. Here I think we have blue leaning mints as well as green leaning mints, and we also have a mix of vibrant and muted tones. So I think this is decently versatile for, you know, a monochromatic palette with 9 pans. I loved the looks I used to get out of this. I would typically do either a monochromatic like blue leaning look or more often a monochromatic green leaning look with tones like this one, this one, this one, and this one, which I actually really loved for a long time. Even after I stopped using some of these other shimmers, I kept using this one, Play It Cool, in the inner corner. It's a really nice inner corner shade. But I've still compared all these shimmers against other shimmers I have in my collection now. I prefer the sparklier, shinier formulas I have now. So I'm gonna make an updated, improved version of this palette, holding on to the mattes and replacing these 4 shimmer shades. I'm also gonna add a shade to replace this one, which was a really, really light mint matte called Get Fresh. I just never used this because I never really wanted or needed a transition shade that light. I would just use something like this as my transition. These days, I really appreciate a neutral transition for more colorful looks like this. So I think I'm gonna actually go rogue and take out a neutral cool toned brown taupe. This is Nothing to See from the Glaminatrix Nearly Natural palette. And I'm gonna put that in for that sort of like first transition shade. This next shade, Mint Tea, is a very green toned shade that's one of the more sparkly shades in the palette. I think this shade is a pretty dead on color dupe for Mint Tea. This is called On the Rocks. It's from the Glamlite Dirty Martini palette. It's very sparkly, very shiny, slightly more blue toned, I would say. And you can see, even though this mint tea shade really outshines the other shimmers in this palette, compared with On the Rocks, it starts to look more like a glow than a sparkle. This next shade is the Iridescent Mint shade Play It Cool. And again, I really do like this shade just on its own merits, but the more impressive version of this that I do have now in my collection is from the Oden Stone and Rock palette. This is the shade Frenzy. I would say again, it's a little bit more on the blue side than the ColourPop shimmer, and it does have like a flash of a brighter blue, and it almost even goes to purple at an angle, which I don't think you're gonna get on camera, but straight on, it does look like a minty teal, and it's just more sparkly, it's more shiny, and it has more of that shift, that contrast between the sheer base and the bright flash. I don't know if you're picking it up on the camera, but the Oden shade really disappears when the light's not hitting it, whereas the ColourPop one, you still see a bit of that chalky kind of texture of the shade itself. It's just less cosmetically elegant. But again, I still like Play It Cool as an iridescent shade, don't get me wrong. I'm going to skip ahead to this shimmer shadow because I have a couple of options for this one. For the shade Freshman down here, which is a muted green toned mint, and that was my go-to shade in this palette, that was my favorite. I'm thinking of replacing that with this shade Earthshine from Devinah, which is a really intense glittery shade, and I think that this captures some of the same mutedness, almost grunginess. It's sort of somewhere between a sage green and a mint green, and I would say something similar about this shade Freshman. They both have that kind of earthy, sagey vibe, but obviously this is a very, very dull, flat shimmer, and this is a very sparkly glitter. Now this middle shimmer shade called Mojito Mami is, I don't know, I don't know if there's anything that distinctive about it. It just feels like a middle of the road mint. It's shinier than Freshman, but not as sparkly as the others. Doesn't feel particularly unique. I don't know like what to pick out about it to replicate in like a dupe shade. So I have a couple of options and I just kind of want to swatch them out and see what feels right. So this is from the Dirty Martini palette from Glamlite. It's called Gin. It's a very similar shade to this matte. It's just a basic shimmer, no shift, but it has that really lovely sparkle and that high shine dimensionality to it. Let's swatch Mojito Mami next. And to be fair, this is a very smooth formula that I used to find very flattering on my lids. When I would try and use sparkly shades back in the day, I didn't really know how to prep my lids, and I was also using I guess poor quality sparkles, and so using those kinds of shades would make my lids look really crepey. Using shades with a finger would make my lids look really crepey. So I was taking shades like this, dusting it across my lids with a dry fluffy brush to get a very, very smooth, sheer, sheeny application, and that's what I liked. So I liked finishes like this, like I had in the Mint to Be palette. This wasn't a defect of the palette for me at the time. So yeah, those are not color dupes at all. Definitely different formulas also. Let's swatch this next shade. This is Frost from the Beauty Bay Earthy palette. And this is a very muted, grungy, teal kind of shade, so a very different interpretation of mint. And as much as I like that shade, I think Gin fits better with the vibes of the palette. Gin really matches this matte. That said, I think Frost really matches this matte, so it's not like there isn't that vibe in the palette already also. I just feel like maybe I'm covering it with Earthshine, and I'd like to have something representing those more vibrant tones. Let's swatch this out and see what we think. So here are the swatches of my version. Overall, my palette definitely leans bluer than the original. For example, this matte shade doesn't really feel like it has a counterpart. I mean, the closest thing would be On the Rocks here, but even that looks slightly bluer than the shade it's duping, even though it comes from a monochromatic green palette. Here are the swatches in slightly lower light. I'm surprised I don't love this more as a monochromatic palette. Monochromatic. I think this actually does throw off the vibe quite a bit. Let me just wash that swatch off, because while I think that would be practical for me as a first transition, I don't love the look of it in the swatches. There. I still think I'm not as excited about this as a monochromatic palette as I expected, given how much I loved the Mint to Be palette. But I definitely have functional dupes for these shimmer shades, and I don't feel bad about letting them go. I just think maybe the Mint to Be monochromatic 9-pan had a little bit of magic to it that I'm not able to recreate right now in my singles collection, and that's fine. I think part of that magic is nostalgia. But that said, when I want mint toned eye looks, I will be using these, and I will be fine with that. I will be happy with the way those looks turn out. Thank you for joining me for this journey. I hope that you will stay tuned for the next installment of this series as I continue to go through my other ColourPop monochromatic 9-pans. I'd love to know, did you also have these palettes? Do you still have them in your collection? Did they live as large for you as I feel like they did in the makeup community overall? I hope that you will subscribe to my channel and stay tuned for future videos. And if you do, I will see you then. Bye!